There is something happening in the night that we have almost entirely forgotten how to speak about. Not because we lack the words. Language, after all, is infinitely plastic, infinitely capable of wrapping itself around any phenomenon, but because we have been trained, systematically and relentlessly, to dismiss what happens when we close our eyes as meaningless, as neurological static, as the random firing of neurons attempting to organize the debris of waking life. And this dismissal, this casual wave of the hand toward 1/3 of our existence, is perhaps the most catastrophic intellectual mistake that Western civilization has ever made. Think about this for a moment. Every night, without exception, you leave. You leave this world, this consensus reality, this agreed-upon hallucination that we call waking life, and you go somewhere else entirely. You enter spaces that operate by different laws, that respond to different logics, that unfold according to principles that have nothing to do with the physics you learned in school. And then you return. Every morning, you return from this voyage into the unknown, and you proceed to act as though nothing of significance has occurred. As though the 8 hours you spent navigating impossible architectures, conversing with entities that may or may not have ever existed in material form, experiencing emotions of such intensity that they dwarf anything available in daylight, as though all of this was simply waste, simply noise, simply the brain taking out the garbage. This is not merely wrong. This is insane. This is the kind of blindness that only a civilization in the terminal stages of its own delusion could sustain. Because what is actually happening when you dream is something far more radical, far more consequential, and far more terrifying than any materialist framework can accommodate. What is actually happening is that you are stepping into the workshop where reality is assembled before it becomes real. You are entering the laboratory of manifestation. You are visiting the place where the future goes to rehearse itself before it steps onto the stage of your waking life. Terence McKenna understood this. He understood it not as a metaphor, not as a poetic flourish, but as a literal description of how consciousness operates within the larger field of time. And his understanding was not born from armchair speculation or philosophical abstraction. It came from decades of direct experimentation with altered states, from countless journeys into dimensions where the ordinary rules of causality simply do not apply, from a sustained and courageous engagement with the mystery that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. He came back from those journeys with reports, with maps, with descriptions of territories that our culture has no official category for. And one of the most important things he brought back was this recognition that dreams are not random, they are not meaningless. They are, in fact, the most intimate and direct access we have to the process by which reality constructs itself. Now, to understand why this is the case, we need to step back and examine some assumptions that are so deeply embedded in the modern mind that most people do not even recognize them as assumptions. They mistake them for facts. They mistake them for the way things obviously are. But they are not facts. They are beliefs. And they are beliefs that happen to be wrong. The first assumption is that time is linear, that it flows in one direction only, from past through present into future, like a river moving toward the sea. This is the time of clocks and calendars, the time of appointments and deadlines, the time that ticks away regardless of what you do or feel or experience. And within this framework, causality can only operate in one direction. The past causes the present causes the future. Nothing can flow backward. Nothing can reach back from what has not yet happened to influence what is happening now. But this is not what physics actually tells us. This is not what the equations actually describe. At the most fundamental level, the equations of physics are time symmetric. They work just as well running backward as running forward. The arrow of time that we experience, this feeling that the future is fundamentally different from the past, is not written into the laws of nature. It is an emergent phenomenon. It arises from thermodynamics, from entropy, from the statistical behavior of large numbers of particles. But at the quantum level, where the real action is, time is far more fluid, far more negotiable than our ordinary experience would suggest. McKenna took this seriously. He recognized that if time is not fundamentally linear at the deepest level of reality, then our experience of linearity must be, in some sense, a kind of user interface, a simplification, a way of rendering something incomprehensibly complex into a form that biological organisms can navigate. And he wondered, what if there are states of consciousness in which this user interface becomes transparent? What if there are conditions under which we can slip behind the screen, behind the simplified presentation of temporal experience, and encounter time as it actually is? Not as a line, but as a field. Not as a sequence, but as a landscape that can be approached from any direction. Dreams, he suggested, are precisely such a condition. When you dream, you are not bound by the same temporal constraints that govern waking awareness. In dreams, time loops and folds and contradicts itself. The future can appear before the past. Events can cause their own causes. And rather than dismissing this as mere confusion, as the brain failing to properly organize experience, McKenna proposed that we take it as evidence. Evidence that the dreaming mind has access to temporal dimensions that the waking mind, locked into its linear interface, cannot perceive. This is not mystical nonsense. This is actually a fairly conservative interpretation of what quantum mechanics and relativity theory already imply about the nature of time. The mystical part, if we want to call it that, is the recognition that consciousness is not merely along for the ride. Consciousness is not simply observing a reality that unfolds independently of it. Consciousness is participating in the creation of reality. It is selecting, moment by moment, from an infinite field of potentiality, the specific actualities that will become manifest. And this selection process, McKenna argued, does not begin when events become visible in waking life. It begins much earlier. It begins in the dream space, in the imaginal realm, in that strange territory where possibility has not yet crystallized into fact. What he was pointing toward is something that shamanic cultures have known for tens of thousands of years. The dream is not a reflection of waking life. Waking life is a reflection of the dream. The things that happen to you in the day, the opportunities that arise, the obstacles that appear, the people who enter and exit your story. These are not random. They are not accidents. They are the downstream consequences of patterns that were established elsewhere. Patterns that were tested, refined, and selected in a dimension of experience that most modern people have been trained to ignore completely. Consider your own life for a moment. Consider the major turning points, the decisive moments, the times when everything changed. If you look back honestly, if you examine those moments with real attention, you will almost certainly find that they were preceded by something, by a feeling, by a premonition, by a dream that seemed significant at the time, but that you probably dismissed as coincidence when it appeared to predict what later occurred. We have all had these experiences. We have all felt that strange sense of recognition when something happens that we somehow already knew was going to happen. And rather than taking this recognition seriously, rather than allowing it to reshape our understanding of how reality works, we explain it away. We tell ourselves that memory is reconstructive, that we are projecting backward, that we are fooling ourselves into thinking we knew something we did not know. But what if we are not fooling ourselves? What if that sense of recognition is exactly what it appears to be? Evidence that some part of us had already visited that moment before it arrived. Evidence that the future is not as closed, not as inaccessible as our culture would have us believe. This is what McKenna was pointing toward. Not as speculation, but as testable hypothesis. Not as belief, but as invitation to experiment. The experiment is simple, though it requires discipline. Begin paying attention to your dreams. Not casual attention, not the vague acknowledgement that something happened last night that you cannot quite remember. Real attention. The kind of attention you would give to an important message from someone you trusted completely. Write them down. Record them. Notice the themes that recur, the symbols that appear repeatedly, the emotional tones that characterize different periods of your dreaming life. And then watch. Watch what happens in your waking life in the days, weeks, and months that follow. Look for correspondences. Look for echoes. Look for the moments when something that happened in a dream becomes visible in the day. What you will find, if you pursue this experiment with any consistency, is disturbing. It is disturbing because it violates everything you have been taught about how reality operates. You will find that dreams do not merely process the past. They anticipate the future. They preview it. They test run it. And the preview is not always literal. Dreams speak in the language of symbol and metaphor. They compress and expand. They substitute and transpose. But when you learn to read that language, when you develop fluency in the grammar of the unconscious, the anticipatory function becomes unmistakable. You will dream of water before periods of emotional turbulence. You will dream of construction before periods of building and creation. You will dream of death before periods of transformation. And sometimes, increasingly as you pay attention, you will dream of specific events before they occur. Not metaphorically, literally. You will see faces before you meet them. You will hear names before you learn them. You will know things that you have no business knowing. This is not supernatural. This is not magic in the cheap theatrical sense. This is the natural function of a consciousness that is not bound by the limitations that materialist philosophy has tried to impose on it. And once you recognize that this function exists, once you accept that some part of you is already in contact with what has not yet happened, you are faced with an extraordinary question. Not can we predict the future? That question answers itself through direct experience. But can we influence it? Can we use the dream space not merely to preview what is coming, but to participate in its selection? Can we become conscious collaborators in the process by which potential becomes actual? McKenna believed that we could. He believed that the dreaming mind is not a passive observer, but an active participant in reality creation. And he believed that the reason most people experience their lives as happening to them, as a sequence of events over which they have little control, is precisely because they have abandoned the dreaming dimension. They have ceded their creative authority to forces that are more than happy to fill the vacuum. Forces that do not have their best interests at heart. Forces that benefit from a population of people who believe themselves to be powerless, who believe that reality is fixed and given rather than fluid and negotiable, who never think to ask who is doing the dreaming that determines what becomes real. This is where the inquiry becomes not merely philosophical, but political. Because the management of dreams, the control of the imaginal dimension, is not a neutral activity. It is contested territory. And the forces that currently dominate our world, the forces of commerce and control, of manipulation and manufactured consent, are very much aware of the power that resides in this domain, even if most individuals are not. They know that whoever controls the images controls the outcomes. They know that the battle for the future is won or lost, not in the realm of fact, but in the realm of imagination. And they have invested enormous resources in colonizing that realm, in filling it with their images, their narratives, their pre-packaged dreams, designed to ensure that the future unfolds according to their specifications, rather than yours. This is why reclaiming the dream space is so important. This is why paying attention to your dreams is not merely a personal practice, but a revolutionary act. Every time you remember a dream, every time you take seriously what arises from your own depths, you are asserting autonomy over a dimension of experience that immense power is invested in controlling. You are declaring that the future is not yet written, that the images that will become tomorrow's reality are still being selected, and that you intend to participate in that selection consciously rather than surrendering it by default to whoever happens to be broadcasting the loudest signal. Now we need to go deeper into the mechanics of this, because it is not enough to simply assert that dreams anticipate reality. We need to understand how this happens. We need to develop a model, however provisional, of what is actually going on when the dreaming mind reaches into the future and brings back information that has not yet crystallized into fact. And to do this, we need to examine one of McKenna's most radical and controversial ideas: the notion that time itself has a structure, a shape, a topology that consciousness can navigate. For most of human history, in most cultures around the world, time was understood to be cyclical. The seasons returned, The celestial bodies traced their paths, and then traced them again. Birth led to death, led to birth again. And this cyclical understanding of time was not merely a primitive error, not merely the confusion of people who did not yet have accurate calendars. It was a recognition of something fundamental about the way patterns recur, the way themes return, the way certain configurations repeat themselves across different scales of temporal experience. The modern West abandoned this cyclical understanding in favor of a linear model. Time became an arrow, pointing from a definite beginning toward a definite end. History became a line of progress, moving from worse to better, from primitive to advanced, from darkness into light. And this linear understanding served certain purposes. It supported the ideology of endless growth. It justified the belief that the future would always be better than the past. It provided a framework within which technological acceleration could be understood as inherently positive, as movement in the right direction. But this linear model is breaking down. It is breaking down because the promise it contained, the promise of perpetual improvement, of endless betterment, is visibly failing to materialize. The future does not feel like progress anymore. It feels like crisis. It feels like convergence. It feels like the approach of something that all the forward momentum in the world cannot avoid. And in this context, McKenna's alternative model of time begins to make a strange kind of sense. He proposed that time is neither simply cyclical nor simply linear. It is both. It is a spiral. And more than that, it is a spiral with a specific destination. He called this destination the transcendental object at the end of time. And whatever you make of that phrase, whether you take it literally or metaphorically, whether you find it compelling or absurd, what he was pointing toward was a recognition that time might have a purpose, that the unfolding of events might be directed towards something, that the future might be pulling us toward it just as much as the past is pushing us away from it. And in this model, the dreaming mind becomes comprehensible as an organ of navigation. It is the part of consciousness that is sensitive to the attraction of the future. It is the compass that orients toward what is coming. Think about what this implies. If time has a destination, if there is something that the process is moving toward, then the future is not merely unknown. It has a shape. It has a contour. It exerts an influence that can be felt by consciousness that is sensitive enough to detect it. And this is exactly what happens in dreams. The dreaming mind feels the shape of what is coming. It registers the gravitational pull of events that have not yet occurred, but that are already exerting influence on the present moment. And it translates this information into the language of imagery and symbol, into the stories and scenarios that we experience when we sleep. This is why dreams so often feel prophetic. Not because the future is fixed and predetermined. McKenna was very clear that this is not the case, but because certain patterns, certain attractors, certain configurations of possibility are more probable than others. They have more weight, they pull harder, and the dreaming mind, freed from the constraints of linear temporal perception, can feel this weight. It can sense which possibilities are gathering momentum, which potential futures are becoming more likely to actualize. And it reports this information to the waking self in the only language available to it, the language of dream. This also explains why the future can be influenced, why the dreaming dimension is not merely a passive preview, but an active workspace. If the future is not fixed, but is being selected from a field of possibilities, then the selection process itself is subject to influence. Every conscious choice we make, every intention we hold, every image we nurture in imagination, participates in determining which possibilities become actual. And the dreaming mind is where this participation is most direct, most intimate, most powerful. Because in dreams, we are working at the level of images. We are operating in the very medium out of which reality is constructed. McKenna often spoke about the logos, about language, about the idea that reality is in some sense made of language. And this idea, which sounds so strange to modern ears, becomes clearer when we understand what he meant by language. He did not mean merely words. He meant meaning itself. He meant the semantic dimension of existence, the layer of reality where things signify, where patterns carry information, where form expresses content. And this layer is not separate from the physical layer. It is not a ghostly overlay on an otherwise meaningless material substrate. It is fundamental. It is primary. The meaning comes first, and the matter follows. Dreams are experiences of this primary layer. When you dream, you are not experiencing physical reality filtered through consciousness. You are experiencing consciousness itself, meaning itself, the semantic dimension in something closer to its raw form. And this is why dreams feel so significant, even when their content seems bizarre. It is not the specific images that matter. It is the fact that you are experiencing reality at the level where images determine outcomes. You are swimming in the medium of manifestation. Now here is where things get truly interesting. If dreams are experiences of the semantic dimension, if they are direct encounters with the layer of reality where meaning organizes itself into form, then working with dreams becomes something like learning to read and write in the language of reality itself. It becomes a form of literacy. And just as literacy in ordinary language transforms what a person can know and do, literacy in the language of dreams transforms what is possible. Most people approach their dreams, when they approach them at all, as consumers. They wait for dreams to happen to them, and then they try to interpret what has appeared. This is not wrong. Interpretation is valuable, but it is only half the picture. The other half is production. It is the recognition that you can learn to participate actively in the dreaming process. You can bring questions to the dream space. You can incubate specific images. You can ask for guidance and receive it. And you can take what you receive and work with it consciously, nurturing certain possibilities and withdrawing attention from others. This is what the shamans knew. This is what the temple sleepers of the ancient world practiced. This is what every effective magical tradition has understood in one form or another. The dream is not entertainment. It is not processing. It is a doorway into the workshop where reality is being manufactured. And the person who learns to work skillfully in that space gains access to levers of influence that are simply not available within the waking paradigm. McKenna practiced this himself. He worked with dreams. He worked with plant teachers. He worked with techniques of consciousness exploration that gave him access to dimensions of experience that most people never visit. And what he brought back from those explorations was consistent and clear. The reality we experience in waking life is downstream from something else. It is the solidified residue of a process that occurs in a more fluid dimension. And that more fluid dimension is not inaccessible. It is visited every night by every human being on the planet. We simply do not recognize what we are visiting. We do not understand the significance of where we go. This lack of understanding is not accidental. It is cultivated. It is the result of a sustained campaign, stretching back centuries, to disconnect people from their own depths. The materialist worldview that dominates modern education, modern media, modern medicine, modern everything. This worldview did not arise naturally. It was constructed. It was promoted. It was enforced, sometimes subtly and sometimes violently, until it became so ubiquitous that most people cannot even imagine an alternative. And one of its primary functions is to ensure that people do not take their dreams seriously. Because if people took their dreams seriously, they might begin to question the official account of what is real. They might begin to suspect that they have access to something that the authorities would prefer they did not know about. They might begin to reclaim their creative authority over their own lives. This is not paranoia. This is simply observation. Look at how dreams are treated in mainstream culture. They are jokes. They are irrelevant. They are symptoms to be medicated away. Any attempt to take dreams seriously is immediately branded as irrational, as primitive, as a regression to pre-scientific modes of thought. And this reaction, this reflexive dismissal, is far too consistent and far too aggressive to be innocent. It is the reaction of a system that knows it has something to protect. It is the defensiveness of an established order that understands, at some level, that the dreaming dimension is a threat to its authority. Because it is. It absolutely is. The dreaming dimension, is the one domain that cannot be fully colonized. It is the one territory that remains accessible to every human being, regardless of their social position, their economic status, their level of education. It is democracy of the most radical kind. Every person has the same portal. Every person can walk through. And what they find on the other side is their own creative power, their own capacity to participate in the generation of reality, their own connection to a process that is so much larger, so much more mysterious, so much more significant than anything the official culture acknowledges. McKenna saw this clearly. He understood that the recovery of the dreaming dimension was not merely a personal project, but a cultural imperative. He understood that a society that takes its dreams seriously would be a fundamentally different kind of society, more imaginative, more flexible, more aligned with the actual structure of reality. And he understood that the forces arrayed against this recovery were formidable. Not because they are all-powerful, they are not, but because they have convinced most people that there is nothing to recover. They have performed the perfect magic trick. They have made the most significant domain of human experience disappear by persuading everyone that it does not exist. But it does exist, and it is waiting. Every night, it opens. Every night, the invitation is renewed. The question is whether you will accept it, whether you will begin to take seriously what happens when you close your eyes, whether you will allow yourself to discover what you already know but have been trained to forget, that you are not merely an observer of a reality created elsewhere. You are a dreamer, and the dream is the place where your participation in the creation of what becomes real is most direct, most powerful, most consequential. Let us speak now about the nature of change itself, about how transformation actually occurs, not in theory, but in practice. Because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the philosophical recognition that dreams anticipate reality becomes operational, becomes something you can actually work with to reshape the conditions of your existence. The first thing to understand is that reality has momentum. It has inertia. The patterns that constitute your life, your relationships, your circumstances, your recurring experiences, these are not simply happening. They are persisting. They have weight. They have trajectory. They are moving in particular directions, and changing that direction requires force. It requires energy applied strategically at the right points in the system. Now, most people who want to change their lives try to apply this force at the level of behavior. They make resolutions. They develop plans. They use willpower to push against the momentum of their existing patterns. And sometimes this works, at least for a while. But more often, it does not. More often, the momentum of the existing pattern is simply too great. The resolution falters. The plan breaks down. The willpower exhausts itself. And the person finds themselves back where they started, often more discouraged than before, convinced that change is simply beyond their capacity. What McKenna understood, what shamanic traditions have always understood, is that the level of behavior is the wrong place to intervene. Behavior is downstream. It is the surface expression of patterns that originate elsewhere. Trying to change your life by changing your behavior is like trying to change a river by pushing on the water. You might create some local disturbance, some temporary deflection, but the underlying current simply reasserts itself, because the river is not being created at the point where you are pushing. It is being created upstream. It is being created at the source. And what is the source? The source is imagination. The source is image. The source is the layer of reality where forms exist before they manifest as physical conditions. And the primary access point to that layer, the primary interface through which ordinary consciousness can touch the imaginal dimension, is the dream. This is why change so often begins in dreams before it becomes visible in waking life. Not merely because dreams anticipate what is coming, though they do, but because dreams are the space where the new pattern is first established. They are the soil in which the seed is planted. And just as you cannot harvest a crop without first planting a seed, you cannot manifest a new reality without first establishing its pattern in the imaginal dimension. Consider how this works. You want something to change in your life. Perhaps a relationship. Perhaps a career. Perhaps a fundamental orientation toward existence. At the level of waking consciousness, you can think about this change. You can plan for it. You can visualize it. But waking consciousness operates under certain constraints. It operates within the framework of what is already believed to be possible. It operates within the limits of the identity you have already constructed. And these limits are formidable. They prevent you from imagining too radically. They keep your visualizations safe, conventional, bounded by what the ego considers acceptable. Dreams do not operate under these constraints. In dreams, the ego relaxes its grip. The sensor that normally filters experience lets down its guard. And in that opening, possibilities can emerge that would never be permitted in waking awareness. Images can arise that violate the logic of your existing reality. Scenarios can unfold that have no precedent in your experience. Feelings can be felt that your waking self does not even know how to name. And here is the crucial point. These dream images are not fantasies. They are not escapism. They are not wish fulfillment in the dismissive Freudian sense. They are prototypes. They are working models of alternative realities. They are experiments conducted in the laboratory of the imaginal, testing configurations of possibility before they are rolled out into the denser medium of physical manifestation. McKenna spoke about this in relation to his work with psychedelics, which he understood as waking dreams, as deliberate entries into the same dimension that opens spontaneously every night. He reported encountering spaces that seemed to be populated by beings who were engaged in some kind of creative work. Manufacturing, he sometimes called it. Making things. Making ideas. Making forms that would later appear in the world. And he came to believe that what he was witnessing was not merely personal hallucination, but access to an actual dimension of reality. A dimension where the templates of manifestation are designed and refined before they enter the stream of time. Whether you take this literally or metaphorically, the practical implication is the same. The place to begin any significant transformation is not with behavior, but with imagination. Not with plans, but with dreams. And the technique is not complicated, though it requires patience and persistence. It begins with attention. Pay attention to your dreams. This is the first step. Write them down. Not just the interesting ones, not just the ones that seem significant, but all of them. Every fragment you can remember. Do this consistently, night after night, and something begins to happen. The dreams become more vivid. They become more memorable. They begin to respond to your attention. It is as though a channel opens, a line of communication between waking and dreaming consciousness that had been closed by neglect. Once this channel is open, the next step is incubation. Before sleep, hold in mind the change you want to create. Not as a demand, not as a visualization forced by willpower, but as a question, as an invitation. Ask the dreaming mind to show you something, to reveal something, to work on this problem in its own way, using its own resources. And then let go. Release the question and allow sleep to take you. What happens next is variable. Sometimes the response comes immediately, in that night's dream. Sometimes it takes days or weeks. Sometimes it comes in forms so oblique that you do not recognize them until much later. But if you persist, if you maintain the practice, responses do come. And they come from a dimension that has access to information your waking mind does not possess. They come from a perspective that can see patterns your conscious awareness cannot detect. They come from a source that knows what you need better than you know yourself. This is not mystification. This is simply the recognition that consciousness has depths, that there are layers of intelligence within you that operate beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness, and that these layers can be communicated with. They can be consulted. They can be invited into partnership. McKenna was very clear about this. He did not encourage passivity. He did not suggest that you simply receive whatever the unconscious sends and accept it uncritically. The relationship between waking and dreaming consciousness should be a dialogue, an exchange. You bring questions, intentions, problems. The dream brings images, scenarios, feelings. And through the interaction between them, through the ongoing conversation across the threshold of sleep, transformation begins to occur. And it occurs first in the dream space. You will notice, if you pay attention, that changes appear in your dreams before they appear in your waking life. You will dream of new possibilities before those possibilities manifest. You will dream of being different before you actually become different. And this is not merely prediction, this is causation. The dream is not seeing the future, it is making the future. It is establishing the template that will later be filled in with physical detail. This explains something that puzzles many people. It explains why visualization techniques sometimes work and sometimes do not. Why affirmations produce results for some people and fall flat for others. The techniques themselves are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They operate at the level of waking consciousness, which is not where the primary creative work occurs. If the new pattern has not been established in the dreaming dimension, no amount of conscious visualization will be sufficient to manifest it. But if the pattern has been established, if the dream space has accepted and elaborated the new possibility, then the waking techniques become enormously powerful. They become ways of reinforcing and accelerating a process that is already underway. This is why the ancients took dreams so seriously. This is why dream incubation was practiced in temples across the ancient world. Not because they were superstitious, not because they lacked scientific understanding, but because they understood something about the structure of reality that we have forgotten. They understood that the surface world, the world of visible events and measurable conditions, is not where reality originates. It is where reality arrives. And the place where it originates, the source from which it flows, is accessible to anyone who knows how to look. You know how to look. You have always known. Every night you enter the workshop, every night you walk through the door that leads to the place where tomorrow is being assembled. The only question is whether you will participate consciously or continue to sleepwalk through this dimension as you have been trained to do. Whether you will bring intention to this space or allow your creative power to be used by default, co-opted by patterns and programs that do not serve you. McKenna's message was clear. Wake up in the dream. Not in the literal sense of lucid dreaming, though that is one technique among many, but in the broader sense of recognizing what the dream is and what it does. Recognize that you are not merely a spectator in some meaningless neural theater. You are a participant in the generation of reality. And the degree to which you participate consciously is the degree to which you can influence what becomes real. This is power. Real power. Not the power that comes from controlling others, not the power that depends on external resources and circumstances, but the power that belongs to you by virtue of what you are. You are a dreaming being. You are a creature of imagination. And imagination is not escapism. Imagination is the primary creative force in the universe. It is the power that brings worlds into being. And you have access to it. Every night, you have access to it. The question is what you will do with that access. There is a phenomenon that deserves our attention here. It is something that many people have experienced, but that rarely gets discussed in any serious way. It is the experience of living through something, of encountering some situation or person or challenge, and feeling with absolute certainty that you have been here before. Not in the sense of déjà vu, that fleeting feeling of repetition that passes almost as soon as it arises, but something more substantial, a deep recognition, a knowing that goes beyond memory. McKenna called this the resonance between dream and waking life, and he suggested that what we are recognizing in those moments is not a past experience that we have forgotten, but a dream experience that we never brought to conscious awareness. The dream came first. The dream established the pattern. And then, weeks or months or years later, the pattern manifested in waking life. We recognize it because some part of us was there when it was being designed. We feel the familiarity because we participated in its creation. If this is true, and everyone who pays sustained attention to their dreams discovers evidence that it is, then it transforms our understanding of what life actually is. Life is not something that happens to us. Life is something that we are making. We are making it in collaboration with forces larger than ourselves, certainly. We are making it within constraints and conditions that we did not choose. But we are making it. We are the dreamers of the dream. Now this raises immediate questions about fate and free will, about determination and choice. If the dream comes first, if the pattern is established before it manifests, then are we simply playing out scripts that have already been written? Are we actors in a drama whose outcome was decided before we stepped onto the stage? McKenna's answer to this was subtle and important. He rejected simple determinism. He rejected the idea that the future is fixed and that we are merely unfolding toward a predetermined conclusion. But he also rejected the naive voluntarism that imagines we can simply choose any outcome we want through sheer force of will. The truth, he suggested, is more complex and more interesting than either of these options. The dream establishes tendencies. It sets up probabilities. It creates attractors that pull reality in certain directions rather than others. But within that field of tendency, there is latitude. There is room for navigation. There is space for choice. And the choices we make, both in waking life and in the dream space itself, influence which tendencies are actualized and which remain potential. Think of it like sailing. You do not control the wind. You do not control the currents. These are given. These are the conditions within which you must operate. But you do control the set of your sails, the angle of your rudder, the timing of your tacks. And these choices, made skillfully within the given conditions, determine where you end up. You cannot sail anywhere, but you are not merely drifting either. You are navigating. You are participating. The dream space is where we learn about the winds and currents. It is where we discover what tendencies are operating, what possibilities are gathering force, what potential futures are becoming probable. And with this knowledge, we can navigate more skillfully. We can position ourselves to catch favorable winds. We can adjust our course to avoid obstacles we would never have seen from the level of waking awareness alone. This is practical information. This is not philosophy for its own sake. If you want to understand what is coming in your life, pay attention to your dreams. They will show you, not always clearly, not always in forms you will immediately recognize, but they will show you. The themes that recur, the scenarios that repeat, the feelings that characterize your dreaming life. These are previews of coming attractions. They are weather reports from the dimension where your future is taking shape. And if you want to influence what is coming, work at the level of the dream. This is where your leverage is greatest. This is where patterns can still be shaped, where trajectories can still be altered, where new possibilities can still be introduced into the mix. By the time something has manifested in waking life, it has already gained considerable momentum. It is much harder to change. But in the dream space, everything is still fluid. Everything is still negotiable. And your imagination, your intention, your attention, these are the forces that determine how the fluid possibilities crystallize into solid realities. There is a technique that McKenna sometimes spoke about, borrowed from shamanic traditions around the world. It involves recognizing that the dream space is inhabited, that we are not alone when we dream, that there are presences, entities, intelligences in that dimension, some helpful, some harmful, some merely indifferent. And that part of developing skill in the dream space involves learning to recognize these presences and to navigate relationships with them. This may sound strange to modern ears. The idea that there might be entities in dreams that have some kind of autonomous existence, that are not simply projections of our own psychology, this offends against everything we have been taught. And McKenna was careful here. He did not claim certainty about the ontological status of these entities. He acknowledged the possibility that they might be aspects of self, subpersonalities, autonomous complexes in the Jungian sense. But he also left open the possibility that some of them might be genuinely other, that the dream space might be a commons, a shared territory, a dimension inhabited by intelligences of various kinds. Whatever their ultimate nature, these presences can be worked with. They can be consulted. They can be invited to assist in the process of transformation. Many shamanic traditions have techniques for cultivating relationships with dream helpers, with spirit allies, with guides who appear in dreams and offer assistance. And whether you understand these techniques psychologically or spiritually, they work. They produce results. People who develop these relationships report access to information and abilities that would otherwise be unavailable. McKenna spoke about this in relation to his own work. He described encounters with entities that seemed to know things he did not know, that offered suggestions and guidance that proved valuable when applied in waking life. And he was always curious about these entities. Not credulous, he did not simply believe everything they seemed to communicate, but curious, open, willing to engage without demanding certainty about what he was engaging with. This is the appropriate attitude. The dream space is vast and strange, and populated by phenomena we do not understand. To approach it with rigid expectations, demanding that it conform to our existing categories, is to miss most of what it has to offer. Better to approach with curiosity, better to explore, better to see what is actually there, rather than assuming in advance what must be there based on theories developed elsewhere. What you will find, if you explore with this kind of open attention, is that the dream space has its own logic, its own ecology, its own laws. It is not chaos. It is not random. It has structure. And as you learn that structure, as you become familiar with its patterns and regularities, you become increasingly able to operate effectively within it. You become a skilled navigator of a terrain that most people stumble through blindly when they visit it at all. And the more skilled you become in the dream space, the more you find this skill transferring to waking life. Because waking life, McKenna suggested, is itself a kind of dream. A dream that has solidified, a dream that has forgotten it is a dream. And the same principles that operate in sleeping dreams operate at a slower pace and in a denser medium in the dream we call reality. This is not to say that waking reality is unreal. It is not to suggest that physical existence is merely illusion. McKenna was not a simple idealist. He acknowledged the density, the resistance, the genuine otherness of the physical world. But he recognized that this density is not absolute. The physical world arises from something. It is an expression of something. And what it expresses, what it arises from, is precisely the imaginal dimension that we contact in dreams. So the relationship is not that dreaming is unreal and waking is real. The relationship is that both are manifestations of a deeper process, a process of imagination, a process of meaning-making form, a process of consciousness exploring its own possibilities. And in both dimensions, similar principles apply. Attention matters. Intention matters. The images we nurture and the images we neglect, these choices matter, because they determine what crystallizes out of the fluid field of potential into the solid structures of actual experience. We have been circling around something that now needs to be addressed directly. It is the question of time. Not time as measured by clocks. That is the thin, linearized version of time that our culture has agreed to pretend is the whole story. But time as it actually is. Time as the medium through which consciousness moves. Time as the dimension of possibility itself. McKenna spent years developing what he called time wave zero, a mathematical model attempting to map the structure of temporal experience. Whatever you think of the specific model, and it has been criticized from many angles, the underlying intuition was profound. Time is not homogeneous. It does not flow evenly. There are periods of acceleration and deceleration, periods of novelty and periods of habit, periods when change comes rapidly, and periods when stasis dominates. And these variations are not random. They have pattern. They have structure. They can, to some extent, be anticipated. The dreaming mind is exquisitely sensitive to this structure. It feels the temporal tides in a way that waking consciousness, locked into its mechanical measurement of identical units, cannot. When novelty is approaching, when something genuinely new is about to emerge into the system, the dream space becomes more active, more vivid, more strange. When the tides are slack, When the period is one of consolidation rather than innovation, the dream space settles into repetition, cycling through familiar themes rather than generating new ones. Pay attention to this in your own experience. Notice the periods when your dreams become unusually vivid, when they seem to be working harder than usual, when they present images and scenarios that feel charged with significance. These are often periods of impending change. Something is coming. The dream space is preparing for it, testing variations, selecting from possibilities. And then, typically some weeks or months later, the change arrives in waking life. And it arrives in forms that the dreams have previewed, that they have rehearsed, that they have made possible by establishing the necessary patterns in advance. This temporal sensitivity is what allows the dreaming mind to function as an organ of anticipation. It is tuned to the structure of time in a way that waking consciousness is not. And this tuning is not mystical. It is simply a different mode of perception, a different kind of awareness, one that registers aspects of reality that the waking mode filters out in favor of the practical demands of navigating physical space. McKenna believed that this capacity for temporal perception, this sensitivity to the shape of time, is one of the most important human faculties. And he believed that it has been systematically suppressed by a culture that benefits from keeping people locked in an eternal present, disconnected from both the depths of the past and the possibilities of the future. A population that cannot feel time, that cannot sense the tides of change, is a population that can be managed. It can be controlled. It can be fed manufactured versions of past and future that serve the interests of the managers rather than the well-being of the managed. The recovery of temporal perception is therefore part of the same project as the recovery of the dreaming dimension. They are not separate capacities. They are aspects of the same capacity, viewed from different angles. When you learn to pay attention to your dreams, you simultaneously learn to feel time differently. You begin to sense the approach of novelty. You begin to recognize the signatures of impending change. And this gives you something that the managed populations do not have: foresight. The ability to see what is coming and to prepare for it. The ability to position yourself advantageously in relation to unfolding events. But the benefits of temporal perception extend beyond mere personal advantage. They extend to a transformed relationship with existence itself. When you can feel time as a living dimension, when you are not simply being carried along by a current you cannot perceive, something shifts in your basic orientation. You become a participant in time rather than merely a passenger through it. You recognize that the future is not simply arriving, but is being created. And you recognize that you are part of that creative process. This is what McKenna meant when he spoke about humans as the imagination of the universe. Not as observers of a universe that would exist perfectly well without them, but as participants in the ongoing generation of reality. The universe is imagining itself through us. It is dreaming itself into new configurations through our consciousness. And the dreaming mind, the capacity that opens every night when we close our eyes, is the specific interface through which this participation occurs. Think about what this implies. Every dream is a contribution to the cosmic imagination. Every image that arises in the night adds something to the total sum of possibility. Every journey through the dream space is a journey of creation, whether we recognize it as such or not. And if we begin to recognize it, if we approach our dreams as creative opportunities rather than meaningless distractions, then the contribution becomes more deliberate, more intentional, more powerful. This is the real meaning of consciousness expansion, in McKenna's view. Not merely having strange experiences, not merely seeing unusual things, but expanding the scope of what we participate in, enlarging our contribution to the creative process, becoming more conscious and therefore more effective collaborators in the generation of reality. And this expansion has no limit. The dreaming dimension is infinite. It contains everything that has ever been imagined, everything that could ever be imagined, everything that imagination can dream into being. And every journey into that dimension is an opportunity for discovery, for encounter, for the reception of gifts from beyond the boundaries of the known. McKenna often spoke about the novelty that is pouring into the world. He saw human history as an accelerating process, moving faster and faster towards some kind of culmination, some kind of unprecedented event or transformation. Whatever you make of his specific predictions, and like all predictions, they are subject to revision in light of unfolding events, the underlying observation seems accurate. Something is accelerating. Something is converging. The pace of change is increasing, and with it the pressure on existing structures, the challenge to established patterns, the demand for creative response. In this context, the dreaming capacity becomes more important, not less. As waking life becomes more chaotic, more unpredictable, more challenging to navigate, the dream space becomes an increasingly vital resource. It is the place where new responses can be tested before they are implemented. It is the laboratory where innovations can be prototyped before they are deployed. It is the training ground where the skills needed for an unprecedented future can be developed before that future arrives. Those who neglect this resource, who continue to treat their dreams as meaningless noise, will find themselves increasingly disoriented as the pace of change continues to accelerate. They will be reactive rather than proactive, responding to events after they have crystallized rather than participating in their formation. They will be perpetually surprised, perpetually behind, perpetually struggling to catch up with a reality that seems to be moving faster than they can follow. But those who cultivate their dreaming capacity, who learn to use the night as a workspace and a navigational tool, will find themselves surprisingly prepared for whatever arrives. Not because they will have predicted every specific event, the future is too complex, too multidimensional for that, but because they will have developed the flexibility, the creativity, the imaginative agility that allows for skillful response to novelty. They will be surfers riding the wave rather than swimmers being tumbled by it. This is the practical promise of taking dreams seriously, not fortune-telling, not supernatural prediction, but the development of a capacity that is natural to consciousness, that is your birthright as a dreaming being, that is waiting to be activated through nothing more exotic than attention and intention. The door opens every night. The workshop is always available. The only question is whether you will enter and what you will do when you arrive. We come now to the deepest level of this inquiry. We have spoken about dreams as anticipation, as the space where reality rehearses itself before manifesting. We have spoken about working with dreams, about using the dreaming dimension as a tool for transformation. We have spoken about time and its structure, about the sensitivity of the dreaming mind to temporal tides that waking consciousness cannot perceive. But beneath all of this, there is something more fundamental, something that McKenna circled around throughout his career, but never quite stated in its starkest form. It is this: we do not dream, we are being dreamed. This is not nihilism. This is not the reduction of the self to illusion. It is rather the recognition that the center of consciousness, the locus of creativity, the place from which reality arises, is not the ego. It is not the waking self with its plans and fears and identifications. It is something deeper, something vast, something that stands to the ego as the ocean stands to a wave. Every spiritual tradition has a name for this deeper center: the self in the Jungian and Vedantic sense, the Atman, the Buddha nature, the ground of being, the Logos. Whatever we call it, the point is the same. Consciousness goes deeper than the personal. It descends into a dimension where individual and universal cease to be distinguished, and this deeper dimension is the true dreamer. It is what generates both sleeping dreams and the waking dream we call reality. And when we experience our dreams, when we enter the space that opens every night, we are participating, however dimly, in the creative activity of this deeper self. McKenna spoke about this in his characteristic way. He talked about the overmind, about the transcendental object at the end of time, about the attractor that is pulling history towards some kind of unprecedented culmination. These are all ways of pointing toward the same recognition, that there is something happening, something intentional, something creative, that exceeds our individual understanding. We are not separate from it. We are expressions of it. We are aspects of its dreaming. And here is where the practical and the mystical converge. If we are aspects of a deeper dreaming, then learning to dream more consciously is not merely personal improvement. It is participation in something cosmic. It is alignment with a creative process that is generating reality itself. And this participation changes us. It transforms us. It expands our identification from the small self that fears and grasps to the larger self that creates and allows. This is the initiatory function of dreams. This is what the ancients knew when they sought dream incubation in temples. They were not merely seeking personal guidance, though they often received it. They were seeking contact with the sacred. They were seeking entry into a dimension where the human and the divine are not separate. And they found it. Generation after generation, culture after culture, they found it. They entered the dream space and they encountered something numinous, something that changed them. We have the same access. Every night the temple opens. Every night the gods walk. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry for its own sake. It is a description of what actually happens when you pay attention to the dreaming dimension with the seriousness it deserves. Numinous experiences begin to occur. Encounters that cannot be explained by reductive psychology. Insights that cannot be traced to personal memory. Gifts that arrive from outside the boundaries of the individual self. McKenna reported such encounters throughout his life, with entities, with presences, with something that seemed to have intelligence, intention, personality, and yet was clearly not human. He did not claim to understand the nature of these presences. He was content to encounter them, to receive what they offered, to participate in the exchange without demanding ontological certainty about what exactly was being exchanged. And this is the appropriate posture. Certainty is not available. Understanding is partial at best. What is available is experience, and experience is enough. The question that faces each of us is whether we will open to this experience or continue to live within the narrow confines that our culture has defined as real. Whether we will accept the invitation that dreams extend or politely decline it in favor of waking priorities. Whether we will learn to dream with awareness or continue to stumble through the night in the fog of assumption. McKenna chose to open. He chose to explore. He spent his life in the dreaming dimension, bringing back reports, developing maps, encouraging others to make their own journeys. And what he consistently reported was this: it is worth it. Whatever the difficulties, whatever the challenges, whatever the strangeness, it is worth it. Because what waits in the dream space is nothing less than your own creative power, your own participation in the generation of reality, your own nature as an aspect of the cosmic imagination. This is not grandiosity. This is not inflation. This is simply what becomes apparent when you pay attention to what is actually happening. The universe is dreaming itself into being, and you are part of that dreaming, not as a passive recipient, not as an insignificant observer, but as an active participant, a co-creator, a collaborator in the ongoing emergence of reality. The future that is coming, and something is certainly coming, will be shaped by many forces. Economic forces, political forces, technological forces, ecological forces. But beneath all of these, the most fundamental force is imagination. What we collectively imagine determines what we collectively create. And imagination is not a fixed quantity. It is not equally distributed. It is developed. It is cultivated. It is strengthened through practice. Dream work is imagination practice. Every night you spend consciously engaging with the dreaming dimension, you strengthen your creative capacity. Every journey into the imaginal realm builds the muscles of manifestation. And this is not merely personal. As you develop, you contribute. Your dreams add to the sum total of images circulating in the collective imagination. Your visions participate in the larger dreaming of humanity. Your creative power joins with the creative power of countless others in the ongoing generation of what becomes real. McKenna saw this as our responsibility, not merely our opportunity, but our responsibility. Because the forces that currently dominate the collective imagination are not benevolent. They are not generating images that serve human flourishing. They are generating images that serve control, consumption, conflict. And these images manifest. They become the reality we all have to live in. The question is whether there will be counter-images, whether there will be alternative dreams, whether there will be enough people dreaming differently to change the trajectory of what is coming. You can be one of those people. You can become a conscious dreamer. Not through any exotic technique, not through any expensive training, but simply through attention. Through taking seriously what happens when you close your eyes. Through recognizing that the night is not merely the absence of day, that sleep is not merely the cessation of activity, that dreams are not merely the static of a resting brain. The night is alive. Sleep is a journey. Dreams are realities in their own right, realities that prefigure and inform and generate the reality we call waking life. This is the invitation. It has always been open. It waits for you every night when you close your eyes. And what you find when you accept it is beyond anything that words can adequately convey. Not because it is vague or mystical in some nebulous sense, but because it is so intimate, so personal, so tailored to your own specific journey that only your own experience can reveal it. The dream is speaking to you. It has always been speaking. The question is whether you will finally listen. The night falls, and with it falls the curtain that separates the possible from the actual. Behind that curtain, the workshop hums with activity. The future is being assembled from the fabric of imagination. And you are invited, have always been invited, to participate in the assembly. Not as a spectator, not as a visitor, as a co-creator, as a dreamer dreaming reality into being. Close your eyes. The door is opening.